So good morning, Hussain. I'm really glad you could join us today. I discovered you first on Twitter, and I know when you introduce yourself, you will tell us a bit about yourself. But I also was really, really interested in, all the things you do to engage learners using technology. And so we wanted to have a quick chat so that you can share some of your top tips with our QMEC teachers to help them with their online seminars and teaching sessions. So welcome, by the way,
Hi.
could you introduce yourself so our teachers who don't know you get to actually meet you in person, well, on this screen anyway?
Sure, no problem. So I'm Dr. Hussain Ghandi. However, more people tend to know me online as Dr. Gandalf, and that's pretty much because I probably got the internet plugged into my brain, as I like to comment on it, or at least my wife does anyway. So I'm a GP in Nottingham. I work in the city centre practice called Wellspring Surgery. I'm also a trainer and a clinical director as well for our Nottingham City East PCN. So I've got all the lovely challenges that are coming through from that. And obviously right now when we're filming this is the COVID vaccination des, which as you can imagine is causing no end of challenges to everybody right now. Yeah. I also have various other roles. I'm one of these people that unfortunately has far too many hats than they should do, and which has kind of forced me to become a lot more effective in the way that I do things. So in addition to being a GP, I'm also a national representative to RC GP Council. I'm currently the treasurer of GP Survival. I'm finishing that role in the next week or so. I'm an LMC representative, a faculty representative, and I also do the Innovate podcast that many of your trainees and stuff hopefully are listening to. So I have a job share for that as well. And probably one of the other main roles that most people know me nationally about is that I run a platform called eGP Learning, which I created a few years back to basically to try and help GPs understand tech, because it's one of my passions. So through that, as a podcast, a YouTube channel and a website, I share loads of content about how to use tech effectively. And that's various aspects of what we do, including obviously managing patients and some of the support services and things we have, like digital first providers. As well as how to do things like video consultations, all the kind of clinical aspect of stuff, and then some of the non-clinical, so particularly how to enhance your teaching, and also some little bits that I just come across that I think are really fun and cool. I've also helped quite a few other people develop their content creation pathways, so things like developing their own podcasts and YouTube channels and that kind of stuff, because once you kind of go down these little rabbit holes, you get really interested and it ends up developing to other kind of stuff. So massive fan of tech. And absolutely a bit of a geek. So those who know me know that I just love all that kind of stuff, board games, Marvel, and that kind of stuff. And I'm actually going to use some of that to kind of give you an idea of how to do some of the teaching aspects of things. So if you wanted examples of how you can use tech, just yesterday, I delivered a tutorial to my 3 trainees that I have in practice about how they can use board games to try and help the information sharing aspect of the consultation. So in rapidly simulating complex information that you're just learning kind of off the fly, and then being able to process and feed that back to patients in a really quick way. And we used board games as the medium whilst doing it through Zoom. So, yeah.
Wow. Impressive. That sounds amazing. And I'm certainly interested in all your Marvel teaching tips and techniques. We're huge Marvel fans in our household with four boys in the house. So I have to say, I think one of the other things is I'm hearing just quite how many hats you wear, and I thought I wore quite a few, but actually, you've probably got 3 times as many as I have. And I think one of the things that I've kind of picked up, and we've had some discussions about, has been sort of productivity. And I think given all that you do, I think it'd be really wonderful if you could share some of that with our teachers. And I think that will come up naturally in the conversation today, some of your top tips. So I wanted to take it back to, as you say, we're in a new world at the moment with COVID, and almost all our teaching at King's is online for our medical students. And so it's been a bit of a rapid transition for us as a department of general practice, and for our teachers to learn how to do this. We started off using Microsoft Teams because of confidentiality. That was the King's approved platform. Most of us sort of feel fairly confident with that, but it's got its limitations. And so we have moved over to, or we use a mixture of Zoom and Microsoft Teams. So I just wondered, sometimes our teachers will not have a choice as to which platform they use, but if they have a choice, I wonder whether you've got any guidance about the pros and cons.
Sure. So like you say, that there's two, particularly in the NHS, there's two market leaders of platforms that we can use. There's actually a lot more out there. But you're right, MS Teams and Zoom are probably the main ones that people focus on for a couple of reasons. So Zoom, pre-pandemic was actually a tool I'd been using quite heavily even before, the pandemic hit and stuff. And one of the things I've always commented on is that actually video conferencing and meetings and stuff has real benefit in terms of how it can improve aspects of the way that you meet, and in terms of accessibility as well. So one of the cases I always explain is that when the PCN DES first started in our local area, we had various different people putting themselves forward to be clinical directors, but actually us getting together to try and manage things like organising the schedules, understanding the role, figuring out all that kind of complex stuff, that was really hard, because trying to get 8 GPs across the entire city into a room on a regular basis to get something up and running in the space of a couple of weeks, that's really difficult, and particularly since at that point, none of us were actually being paid to do the work as well. That was all due to start from July. And obviously, so we had to figure out how we were going to make the best use of our time. And, I kind of mentioned, why don't we just have a video conference meeting? It negated all the issues of travel between clinics and that kind of stuff. It negated the issues of having to pay and find rooms across practices. And it also meant, and this was a really important part, that we could actually record the meetings and share it with those that weren't able to attend, because at the end of the day, not everybody can do. And that mechanism allowed us to actually really rapidly develop a community of PCN clinical leads in our local area that were able to support those that were very new to this kind of stuff, allow those that are more experienced in terms of how to navigate the medical political world and stuff to share their experience a lot more effectively, but also meant that we could respond to a lot of this stuff, and it just made everyone's jobs a lot easier with doing that. So there's definitely power in terms of doing kind of the video meetings and that kind of stuff when it comes to teaching. Obviously, COVID came along and just changed everything. So, we are now having to do this because physically being in a room actually is at more risk to certain people and individuals for obvious reasons that come with COVID and things. So then how do we use this as a mechanism of trying to help with teaching and all that kind of thing? So if we're looking at the two different platforms, you mentioned obviously that you guys started off with MS Teams, and the main and absolute benefit of MS Teams is the fact that it's an NHS approved platform in terms of confidentiality and the way that it can function from there. Admittedly, as a video meeting platform, it probably is a little bit behind Zoom in terms of its functionality, and we'll talk a couple of the key points in a second. But the first one is actually just the simple ease of getting onto Teams. Teams is actually a lot more difficult compared to Zoom to actually just start a meeting. And also because it's less developed, there's more issues with things like screens freezing, audio not flowing as well. And that's just because Zoom have been doing it for a lot longer, and they've got, different servers and that kind of stuff that help to do that. As time goes on, that is improving, and clearly the pandemic made them change a lot of that stuff. So they have improved the way they do things. But you're right, one of the key differences a lot of people find when they use Teams is that the way it presents people on screen is completely different to Zoom. Zoom, you can have it set to kind of speaker view, like what we're using right now to record this with, or you can have the gallery view where you can have, all the different people on the screen. And the capacity for the number of people who can have on screen on Zoom is actually a lot higher. So the default setting is up to 25, although there are options of making it up to 49. And over 49, you get extra screens that you have to shuffle through. Whereas with Teams, it's actually a lot smaller. And even the way it presents yourself, it puts people in different sizes, which is completely random as well. That's the most annoying part. You can't really change the sizes and that kind of stuff. And then once it hits its capacity, you just get people at the bottom in kind of like their avatars and stuff. So that can impact the amount and the ability for you to engage and interact with people when you're doing it. And I think that is sometimes an issue. And I know for when you're having medium to larger groups, when you want to be able to see how well you're being received with the information you're sharing and you're discussing, that can make the engagement a lot more challenging. I think we'll talk about, I guess, ways that we can improve that afterwards. The other massive difference between the two platforms is the capacity to have breakout rooms. So currently, Teams doesn't have breakout rooms. There is a weird hack you can do to make breakout rooms happen in Teams, but it is a little bit admin heavy, and it does require a bit of pre-organization. And to be honest, is not really effective unless you've got significant numbers of people that you're trying to do it for, because otherwise it doesn't tend to be as effective time-wise. But generally speaking, it doesn't have that core functionality in it. Whereas with Zoom, it's pretty easy to do breakout rooms. So, if you wanted to have mini workshops within your session, it's really easy just to click a button. So, and when you're the host, you'll have a button at the bottom that says breakout rooms. You just click on that, and then you can either randomly allocate people into different rooms, or you can just physically move them across depending on the numbers and types of people that you have. One of the things I do recommend, if you're doing a much larger meeting, that you have people specifically whose job that is to do, because otherwise the admin side of that can be quite complex and it can take a while. And also, if you have got a lot of people on the meeting and stuff, just warn people it will take a bit of time for them to end up in their rooms. Otherwise, all you have in the chat is, I'm not in my room, I'm not in my room, I'm not in my room. And that can take ages just to sort out and stuff. So, and actually slows it down when people do that, because there's more data being driven into the system. So just a bit of pre-warning, if you are doing large meetings, we're talking, to be honest, 50 to 100 plus, you do just need to warn people that the point of when they go from their main meeting to their breakout rooms, there is going to be a time frame, and it's surprisingly longer than people can expect. It can be up to a couple of minutes, which in our instant world of internet, that seems like forever, to be honest. So just warn them, it will happen. They just have to hold fire and wait, and it will work. So that's breakout rooms. Important thing to know with Zoom doesn't actually record the breakout rooms automatically. You have to do that separately. So if you are planning on recording the content and stuff, be aware of the fact that that won't record automatically. The people in the breakout rooms do have to press record themselves, so you can capture that information if that's what you're aiming to do. So those, I guess, are the two big differences between the two platforms. In terms of how I guess I would suggest that you look at them, well, I think it inevitably comes down to what is the aim of the session that you're trying to use and what you're aiming to teach, to be honest. If you are looking at a kind of didactic lecture kind of series, okay, that's really easy to do, to be honest. You just need to make sure everybody mutes their microphones, and you've got abilities to screen share, and you can do things from there. And that's good for information dumping, if that's what you're aiming to do, just trying to share information and concepts and that kind of stuff. I think if you're wanting to have more interaction with that kind of stuff, having breaks in between and asking for feedback and questions and that kind of stuff, and using potentially other tools to break it up, can be really effective. So one of my favorite ones that I've been using for the past few years is something called Quizzes. So it's a quiz platform that you can use that allows you to do it through the power of technology, and it's really fun and cool to use. And that has been my main system up until this month, when unfortunately they've now gone to a paid for model. So their free accounts have disappeared, which, to be honest, is slightly annoying, because it is a really good platform, but it's not cheap. So their new mechanisms is quite expensive. So an alternative one, which I've been using for the past month, is something called Menti, which probably a few of your trainers and stuff have come across. And Menti is actually a really powerful platform. It does most of what Quizzes does. Probably doesn't do it as nicely, if I'm being honest, so I am still missing it. But it does have the option of getting feedback from people, so you can do various things, like the word cloud, I guess, is the one that most people have come across, where you put a couple of words, you ask a question, ask people to share their thoughts, their emotions, what their perspectives are. So classic ones I've done is, what type of video consultations do you find really challenging to do, that kind of stuff. Most people know about that. You can actually use it to do various other kind of things. So you can actually use it as a quiz platform and allocate points and stuff like that based on how people answer the questions. You can use it to do mind maps. You can use it to do graphs and all that kind of stuff and other kind of information. So it is a very powerful platform, and it's so easy to use, directing people to a really simple website, stick in a code, and you can join us, and that works really, really well. So that's one option. Another one is using Slido, which, again, I'm guessing people have probably heard of and possibly used. Slido's much better if you're trying to get questions through the kind of conference or the meeting that you're doing. I must admit, I tend not to recommend using Slido when you're doing video conferencing things, just because you've already got tools within the platform itself. So things like obviously Zoom has its Q&A section. You've got the chat function for MS Teams and that kind of stuff, which also you can use in Zoom. So it may not be as effective, but if you've got significant numbers of people, really large events that you're having to do for, actually having a separate platform for people to do the questions through can actually be more useful, because all you've got is the questions and you don't have the other stuff that comes through from the event itself, which is actually makes the administrative side of it a lot easier. And also you get people to vote on the questions that are more important. So particularly if you're short on time and you know your Q&A time is going to be really pressured, prioritizing the ones that people want to know about, that's a really good way of doing things. So obviously that's one of the key benefits for using Slido and things. So I guess there's some tips to help with a bit more didactic kind of teaching session that you may want to do. When we've got smaller sessions, so the ones where you're trying to look for more kind of engagement and things, then there are different ways you can approach it. And I guess one of the key ones I would say is think about the numbers that you're going to be trying to do this with, and that does massively change the way you're going to approach this. And that purely comes down to the number of people you've got on screen, and it is as simple as that. So if we're going to use Zoom, and admittedly for small group working, I would actually say Zoom is my preferred method of doing it. You've just got a few more tools within Zoom that allow you to do this, and that are easier to use. So Zoom, easily you can have, as I said, up to 24 people on screen. But actually, I found that the sweet spot is around about 6 for small group teaching. And that's because the visuals of when people are on screen and on camera are much larger and much easier to engage with. And once you kind of go above 6 or 6 to 10, Zoom has to resize the images that you have for most people on screen. And it makes it a little bit more challenging to coordinate how you speak to people, what you see of people and that kind of thing. So it's a small thing that people don't really think about, but it makes a massive difference in terms of the level of engagement you've got with people. The other thing is once you have more than that, the chat goes a lot quicker. And as a result of that, it's harder to keep an eye on what the alternate discussions are. And it's important to not forget that the chat can be a really rich source of information, as well as how you can deal with people. Because one of the downsides of obviously video meeting is people don't always want to be on camera. You know, for some people, it is a really hard thing to do, whether it's down to anxiety issues, whether it's down to personal issues. You know, some people find it really, really challenging. I think there is a cohort of people who find it just an easy way of attending stuff without really attending as well. So they will turn up to a session, switch off the camera, switch off the mic, and then are they actually there? Well, you don't really know. And I think there is, unfortunately, that element of things that people are concerned about, both from a teacher perspective, but also, you know, I know people do it. I've done it, to be honest. I've had to do it because there have been times where I've had to engage with meetings and sessions whilst, for example, I've been on call. So I've just had to deal with something else. So I've had to switch it off and things. But I think the key thing I would say when it comes to those kind of aspects is be honest, first of all. And at the start of the session, when you are hosting it, when you are that you know, whether you're the trainer leading the session or whether it's a meeting or whatever, set the ground rules, to be honest. Just be open and honest. This is the reason why we are doing it, you know, this way. So I would ask that everybody keeps their cameras on at the start. If you are having lots of people, okay, switching off the cameras may help with the stream and make things move more smoothly. So you do have to recognize that is a factor. But actually for smaller groups, it shouldn't be a problem. The platforms will work. So, you know, saying to people, actually, we want the cameras on so we can engage and we can have a better discussion. And it is more likely to bring engagement from the attendees if their cameras are on, because then they can actually visually, as well as audio wise, interact with people. I think for those that feel that they can't have their cameras on, I would often ask them for a justification as to why that's the case. So is it because, you know, you're in an environment where you can't share what you've got in the background? Okay, again, the platforms have helped with that. You can stick a fake background up and that's not an issue. Is it just because you're in your PJs and you don't want to share people? Well, to be honest, there's an element of professionalism that needs to be accepted here. And actually that's not acceptable. And that comes to probity, which is obviously a key skill that we need to be aware of with our peers and stuff. So I find tackling the issue head on is often the easiest and least confrontational way. I know for some people that may seem weird that you're kind of at the start mentioning this, but actually it tends to work out a lot better and it's fairer saying to people that actually everyone else is doing this, that's reasonable. But also accepting, I think, if there's a good reason why people can't have their cameras on, if they can't have their mic on all the time, fine. You just have to accept that sometimes that's the case. That's the world we live in. And like I said, a common one I have is, well, if I'm on call at the practice, I'm afraid there are going to be times my mic and my camera and everything has to go off. It's just the nature of the only way I can attend at that point.
I was just saying, it's one of the things our teachers will learn at all their teacher development sort of sessions that, we start every small group session with ground rules, and so I agree that's even more sort of important on a, online. I was thinking about that sweet spot being 6. Unfortunately, we have, or not unfortunately, but we have at King's a big year. So we've got 450 students per year. They all have on their GP blocks small group seminars, and also in their psychiatry placements they've got small seminars. But again, so the numbers are slightly over that sweet spot. So it's usually 8 students in a small group, and so it's just over. So so given the fact that our teachers are often doing workshops with our students, and there are about 8 of them there, I just wondered, you've already started touching on some of the tools they can use and how they can encourage that interactivity. But I wonder, with small groups of 8, what other top tips have you got to really encourage that interactivity?
So I think when you've got towards 8 people, it's important to remember that then the way that you can do things is just slightly different. It's not a big thing, like you say, it's just over the 6 kind of criteria. I guess the 6, there's no evidence about it. It's just what I found personally. I think in terms of various different ways you can approach the session. So one of the key things that video conferencing allows you to do is obviously screen share. And that has a really important interaction in the way that you can do things. So you can share obviously any kind of information that you want to, and you can walk through that with your trainees and your students and that kind of stuff. So you can actively share what you want to show them. And that can be a really good way of getting engagement, because you're actually asking them to focus their attention on something else. When you are having just a video conference meeting or session where people are just talking, it's quite easy to zone in and zone out, particularly when the microphones are off and people know that they can't hear you. But then if you're actively asking them to pay attention to something, that's where you get a much better element of engagement. So actually interspersing elements where you have to have the attendees attention on something, and using screen share on and off to do that is a really powerful way of trying to say to people, actually, I need you to focus your attention. And it just changes their mindset of how they're engaging with the meeting. So they've kind of gone from casually consuming the information to actively having to do something. And always follow that up with a question. That's the key thing. Have in that structure something that you're going to ask them to do as a result of the information they've just had to observe and stuff. So then that, again, that helps and reminds them to keep their attention on what's going on. Now, the way that you can further push that, now there are kind ways of doing that, and there's slightly less kind ways of doing that. So obviously the kind ways just say, stick it in the chat and answer your questions there. And again, that is a nicer way of doing it, because you're not picking on anyone in particular. Obviously, the more interesting way of doing that is selecting people from the group and say that this is going to be an interactive session. Again, it comes into that the pre-information and things, how you start the meeting. I'm actually going to be asking people to answer questions throughout. I'm just going to pick you random based on who's on my screen, and that is a really nice way of trying to make it random. So you can say the first one, I'm going to go for the top left. Next one, I'm going to go for top right. You don't have to specify how you're doing it, but it's a good way of saying to people that actually it's going to be completely random how I'm choosing people based on the screen. Because it's important to remember, every time you start and stop screen shares, all the platforms will reorganize people in terms of where they are on your screen. It never stays the same. So it is random. And therefore, that's a really nice way of trying to signpost to your trainees that actually I am just picking it on random. And that hopefully can help to drive some of the engagement and stuff that you have with people, because that they are now aware that they will have to engage at different points. You can use some of the tech tools to help with that. So getting people's interactions and things in terms of the subject matter, the topics, or that kind of stuff. An alternate one is actually handing over the screen share and saying to, planning as part of your tutorials and stuff that you're doing, I want you to share your work that you've done with me on whatever topic that be. Now, clearly that has bearing in terms of what they're doing and stuff, but being able to open and activate that is really useful. And then the third one, which is potentially a bit more challenging because it does require some pre-work in terms of how you're going to structure it and how you're going to plan it, and thinking through the kind of process, but either using things like the whiteboard function on Zoom to collaborate and work on something as you're doing it, or using cloud-based platforms such as Google Docs. Or actually, this is one area where Teams probably does excel, using their own onboard platform for PowerPoint and Word and that kind of stuff to collaborate, work with. Then that can work really effectively in terms of how you're asking people to focus their attention on what they're having to do. And that could be something as simple as, I'd like you to create a workflow for how you would manage a patient with chest pain. Let's do this interactively. Let's draw this on the screen, for example. Let's create a flow, or I want you to think of all the different points, and 3 of you, I'm going to ask you to look at how you do this as the history part. 3 of you, I'm going to ask you to look at how you do that from a management part. 3 of you, what examinations are you going to do? I want you to work on those 3 sections. Here's the screen share, here's the document, start typing. And that can work really well, particularly, as I said, on Teams, because that element of stuff is integrated within Teams compared to Zoom, where you would have to use either just the whiteboard function, which is okay, or obviously something like Google Drive or Teams or other kind of things to do that. So that's a really powerful way, I think, of trying to improve the engagement, because you're actively, like I said, you're trying to keep the attention of people within the session, and having to do that.
It made me think about sort of, thinking again about those sort of sweet spots and the optimal time. I was just wondering, I have been, like many of us, in a meeting for 2 hours. It's a long time online, especially to be sat in one place as well. And, and so I have really tried to kind of minimize the time that I have with students. I've tried to, that we're actually sitting here, so I try and give them the information beforehand, all the slides beforehand. Not that everyone will look at it, but I'm quite clear that this is why I'm doing it, so that I can whiz through some of the slides and we can really talk about and unpick important concepts. But I just wondered, in your kind of experience, whether you've got ideas about what's sort of an optimal time to kind of be sitting here doing, a workshop or interacting with others in a small group, but also that sort of frequency of, how often you should have something that is more interactive. So I can't remember where I read this, but somewhere I read it should be like every 7 or 8 minutes that you're kind of, having something else. And, that kind of makes sense to me, that you're not, going on for longer than 10 or 15 minutes, just one voice.
Sure. I think part of it comes down to the content you're trying to share, and again, the number of people you've got involved as well, because important to remember, the larger the number of people you've got, the more administrative support you're going to need to try and do interaction, particularly if you're looking at things like breakout rooms and that kind of stuff. And important to recognize the time that is going to take to do it. So, for example, if you've got 100 plus people, you're trying to put them into breakout rooms, just simply that process of putting them into the breakout rooms is going to take at least 3 or 4 minutes out of your session. And then you're going to need time for people to come back, settle down. Again, that's at least 3 or 4 minutes. So realistically, if you're pushing it at the best, you've got 6 minutes or so that you're just losing every single time you try and break out into breakout rooms. So if your session is only an hour long in terms of the time that you planned for this, you've lost a good chunk of time just on getting started for one activity. And that's ignoring how long you actually give them for the activity itself. So absolutely planning the way that you're going to have interactions and breaks in your session is really important. I guess in terms of the sweet spot, I would generally say that, 40 minutes for most meetings, if you're going over that, you're going to lose a lot of people. In terms of a general kind of online kind of meeting, and absolutely the maximum should be an hour without any form of, longer term break. So, something away from the screen completely, where you can just say, look, we're just going to switch off for a bit. And we're going to have a break and stuff. So, for example, yesterday, I actually coordinated our regions practice learning time. talking about tech and how they can use it in practice. And we had 3 different sessions. Each we kind of maxed out 45 minutes, including question time. So that the presentations finished at half an hour. We had about 10, 15 minutes or so of question time after each part. But then there was a good 10-minute break at least, where we just said, look, we're switching this off. Go grab a coffee, go grab go to the loo, whatever you need to do, that kind of stuff. And we'll come back in 10 minutes. And that's essential, to be honest, because like you said, if you're going for 2-3 hours at a go, which I know some people have tried to do that, people lose interest. They're really, I mean, do you blame them? Most movies will max out about 1.5 to 2 hours, and that's stuff that people want to watch because they're interested in it. If you've got stuff that isn't always relevant or information that doesn't require them to have any engagement, it won't be long before they switch off and stuff. So recognizing that breaks and periods of interaction have to play with that. You mentioned about the 7-8 minutes. If you look at the kind of content creation side of things, there's a general rule of thumb that you have different watersheds in terms of how long people engage with content before they get bored of it. So actually the first watershed is 7 seconds. So to capture somebody's attention, you've got 7 seconds to do that. After that, you've probably lost them just in terms of them being interested in looking at something. The next watershed is about a minute or so. And that's one of the reasons why most of the social media platforms have their way that they post and stuff as the maximum is a minute. So for example, Instagram and TikTok and all those kind of things, you can't go over a minute in terms of the amount of content you can upload. And that's for good reason, because they know, and these are the people with all the data in terms of how people consume that, information, that actually over a minute, you get a massive drop off in the way that people engage with stuff. After that, it comes to, you're right, it's about 7 or 8 minutes. And the general rule of thumb is 10 minutes max is your next kind of watershed point. Because after that, people, in terms of if it's something they're interested in, they want to consume, they're less likely to do so. And then the next one after that is typically the big one. It is, like I said, it's about half an hour to 40 minutes or so. And again, it does depend on the type of content and also the way that you're sharing it. So audio content, those timeframes are actually a lot longer than video content, which the timeframes tend to be shorter and stuff. So it's also important to remember how that's going to look afterwards. And I guess the reason why I say that, I mentioned earlier that one of the key benefits of doing video meetings is the capacity for you to record stuff. And this is an example of that. So we're recording this to share with, obviously the trainers and stuff. Video obviously has the benefit of having the visual interaction and the fact that you can show people how to do things. However, audio is a really good way of trying to engage with this kind of stuff. So if it's just discussion, if it's just about information retrieval from, what people are talking about, then actually audio can often be a much better way of doing that, because people are more likely to listen for longer periods of time if it's something that they're interested in compared to watching something, because it requires less involvement. And particularly, obviously, audio has benefits of being able to be used in other environments outside of it. So I tend to classify things like dead time. So classic ones are when you're driving to somewhere, you can stick the audio on, but you don't have to watch it, because obviously that's not safe. And that can be a really useful way of people being able to consume the information. A lot of the platforms nowadays allow you to do really smart things like speed up the way that you watch them. So instead of watching at 1 speed, you watch at 1.2 or 1.5 speed, which for most people, they can still manage that, understand the content, but they get through it quicker, which is a nice little hack. So I mentioned earlier that with our PCN meetings, we used to record them. What I then used to do is upload them onto a private YouTube channel, share it with the other clinical directors, and say, when you're watching it back, just watch it back at 1.5 speed. You'll get through, our 40-minute meeting in about 30 minutes. And actually, if there's a part you want to slow it down, just go back and slow it down. It just made the process so much easier, in terms of people wanting to engage with stuff. And they were still aware of the information, so that when we came to the next meetings, it was so much easier for them. And it's the same for teaching sessions and things. Trainees can then consume that information at a time that's suitable for them, a bit more convenient. And if you share those little hacks, they tend to be more interested in doing it as well, because they're able to do it in a time frame that's more effective for them.
And because I've never listened to something at 1.5 speed, that's obviously it's not too fast. You can still keep up with the conversation and it's clear, but it's just moving you on that bit quicker.
Yeah, so 1.2 is definitely, generally speaking, it's not a problem. Most people will not notice a massive difference. And actually, if you set your default 1.2, sometimes when you go back to 1.1, you're like, okay, it seems slightly different, but not quite sure. 1.5, I think some people will definitely notice a difference and potentially think, oh, actually, I don't quite like that. It's a bit more challenging. 2.0 speed, okay, you're going to have your chipmunk sound and stuff. But again, if it's, one thing I often do for really big meetings, so unfortunately, like you say, I've had to attend 2-hour meetings and stuff, I will put it at 2.0 speed just to get through it all. And then for the parts that I need to pay attention, I'll just slow it back down a bit and then focus on that. So if it's something that I know that's more important to me, then I'll slow it down for that section.
Perfect. That's a really interesting tip. I'm going to try it. And I agree. I think I listen to my podcast when I'm walking to pick up kids or on the way to work, just because, and sometimes it's just nice not to have that visual stimuli that I can look around at the world but still be listening and absorbing and learning. I wondered whether you might be able to say something about feedback through sort of remote discussions, whether our teachers should be doing that any differently, or just what your experience is.
Sure. So feedback's really frustrating at times because you will want feedback, but you struggle to get it, or you struggle to get meaningful feedback. So I'm actually going to share with you the Dr. Gandalf fix of how to make sure you get some feedback in a way that you want it and need it. Okay. And I appreciate some people won't like this because it is making people do things they probably don't want to do, but it kind of works. So there are a couple of tools you need to have some awareness of knowing. So you need to know how to create forms, first of all, electronically. So whether that's Google Forms or actually, again, MS Teams has its own forms platform now built into it, which is going to become available to everybody working within the NHS when you have your refresh. The second thing you need to know how to do is to have a QR code generator. Okay. So QR codes are those lovely little things that probably everyone's now aware of because of Test and Traced. But those little weird looking barcodes that are like a square, and you can use your phone to access them and scan them, and then it registers information as a result of it. So effectively what you do, you create your feedback form, 3 or 4 questions ideally, nothing more than that. And it's about the information that's relevant to you to understand about that particular session. So whatever that may be. So I do this for almost all of my teaching sessions in terms of what I'm trying to gather, what parts of this was most useful, what parts of this was not useful, that kind of stuff. Any areas for improvement is a classic question that obviously people want to know. And what additional topics would you like to hear about? And if you want to stick a rating question on there, so how useful was this, 1 to 7, 7 being I need to share this with absolutely everybody, it's the best thing ever, and 1 being I was asleep most of the time. Make it fun, make it interactive. And then what you do, you take the shared link of that and put that into a QR code generator. So you got the QR code, and then you simply put that QR code at the end of your session. And then what you do is that the slides that you have from the session, or the additional content that you have, so if you're signposting them to another kind of video or something else that is going to be important to them to have, or access to the recordings of the event is a really good way of doing it. Then you put that at the end of the form. So when they've completed the form, they get the link to it. And that's how I share my slides for trainees and stuff. So if they want that information, all they have to do is they have to fill in the form. And to make it really easy for them to do that, so they don't have to do pretty much anything. I'll say, all you need to do is open your phone, open your camera app, scan the QR code. It'll take you to a link. The form will take you less than a minute or so to fill in. And after that, you get all this stuff that you wanted. And generally speaking, I have between 30 to 70% pickup rate in terms of feedback from people when I've done sessions like that. So when I've done sessions like this, when I've done sessions with, I did a VTS session for, I think, the Yorkshire area, that was 300 people odd. I got 100 replies out of that, so a third of them were willing to give me feedback out of that session. So it's never going to be perfect, but it's a good way of getting some feedback information on the session that you've just delivered. And you can tailor that to however and whichever way you want. And to be honest, it's really easy to do. It takes approximately 10 minutes at the most to set that up. And that's including the time it takes for me to generate the feedback form as well.
because I've used Mentimeter for feedback at the end of every session, but I'm definitely going to try this and see if actually this is, because it doesn't sound like it takes any more time, and there might be a bit more of an incentive for people.
I think that's the key thing. Most of these times, unfortunately, you have to give some sort of incentive for people to want to fill in the feedback. And I guess the reason why I developed that, with having to deliver so many sessions, particularly nationally, often I was told that we'll send you a copy of the feedback form afterwards, but they often come sometimes a month or two after the event. It doesn't necessarily just include my session. It doesn't necessarily have information that's useful for me to know how I want to learn. It's more useful for the people that have created the session themselves, which may or may not be the same thing. So at least this way I know I get the information that I need in order to improve my teaching or what I'm trying to achieve from that particular session. And like I said, it takes a few minutes or so. Once you get into the swing of doing it, one of the things I found is, so I tend to use Google Forms for that because it presents the information really easily for me. And often, at the end of it will have a link to, here's the link to the slides, here's a link to something else that I'm, a video or something that I mentioned that you probably will want, I'll recommend something for them that they may want to engage with. But also you can copy the forms really quickly. So I've now got to the point where if I've got similar sessions I'm doing, I'll go back to the one I've done before, copy it over, change the names. Within 3 or 4 minutes, I've got my feedback form done. And it's just a case of generating code and putting it in from there.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've had a sort of whistle-stop tour through how to kind of engage our students, especially particularly thinking about sort of small groups and making it interactive, and some of your hacks. So thank you for sharing those with us. Any other final tips before we sort of bring this to a close?
I think just to share some resources that you may find also useful. So often we like to try and use images and that kind of stuff to help supplement the learning that we do. One thing I always caution people about that is being aware of copyright issues. So I know loads of people go off to Google, search on Google for an image, and they think, oh, that's a really nice image that helps punctuate my points and the characteristics of what I'm trying to do and everything else. But you've got copyright issues. Now, hopefully it will never be a problem for you whereby somebody could actively sue you for using their image without either attribution or even permission. And sometimes they can still do so even if you have asked for attribution and permission or allocated attribution and stuff. So using completely royalty-free images is always the recommendation I would make to any trainer, so you don't get caught foul of that. And particularly since now we're doing more sharing of teaching sessions online and that kind of stuff where it is a lot more accessible, it's important to be aware of that. So if you are after sites that can help you do that, so 3 of my favorite ones are Unsplash, which is really good for particularly really nice high quality images around landscapes or products and that kind of stuff. If you're after more specific things like concepts and that kind of stuff, then Pexels or Pixabay are really good options as well. And they're all free to use, so you don't have to pay anything for that. And then if you're looking at creating media content, a really good platform to use is something called Canva. So it's an online platform. Again, most of it is free to use. You can pay for it if you want to, but even with the amount of stuff I generate, I've not had to take that step yet. But Canva is a really nice and really simple image editor. So it gives you loads of really cool tools that allow you to create images, videos, whatever you want. For those of you who have seen my content, all the thumbnails and stuff that I create, I do through Canva, and I don't pay anything to do that. I do that myself. You can be as creative as you want, and that could be a really nice way of creating additional media content that can help with whatever you're trying to do. So if you're trying to create images to punctuate your points, slides, coverings and that kind of stuff, other things that can just enhance what you're doing. It also has free music libraries and that kind of stuff that you can also use to, if you want to create videos to emphasize some of the points you want to make in your sessions and things. So yeah, really nice little tool that I definitely recommend to people. And the other one I probably mention is if you have a regular session that you're looking at creating for people in terms of the information you're sharing and stuff, do consider some of the things like creating your own personal podcast or your own YouTube kind of channel and that kind of stuff where you can share that information really easily. Now, obviously, you do need to factor in things like, is that information appropriate for you to share publicly in that route? Clearly, if it's got patient information in there, then absolutely not. That's not something you should be doing. But if you're talking about concepts, if you're talking about teaching and making it accessible and available, that can really be useful. And it's a great way of storing information. And I guess that's one of the things to be aware of with the amount of types of teaching sessions and things that people may want to look at. That can be a really effective way. So, having to reproduce loads of stuff over and over again. So that could be useful. But also giving people an idea of what they want learning on as well. So I've used this with trainees in the past to say, look, these are the various different sessions I've created. Have a look, watch the video, and then we can talk about any questions and stuff. And that way you can cover a lot higher dense information and content a lot quicker. And it's saving you time in terms of what you're having to answer. You're helping them to, the trainees and stuff, tackle particularly challenges that then they're focusing on. And you can probably go a lot deeper into stuff because you've done the pre-work in terms of the initial information that they need to know about various topics and stuff. And if you don't want to create them, there's lots of them out there already. So just, find resources, have your library of them and share them from there.
Brilliant. I think, we were having a discussion amongst us about having a QMEC Teachers YouTube channel so that we can share, for example, our recent conference and all that information for our teachers, but also because actually during COVID and lots of the medical schools have tried to sort of say, actually we've all got these resources, how can we sort of share this together? And so I think that's really helpful. I'm just thinking about my particular take-home points with regards to kind of teaching and as a GP as well. I'm just thinking, I definitely within my teaching, I always do ground rules, but I think I might be a bit more. And I'm you sort of said it was being a bit mean, sort of picking on people. I always do that anyway, but I quite like your kind of idea of the way I do it randomly, depending on where they are on the screen. So and being explicit about that. So I think I'll do that. I'm going to try Google Docs instead for my take-home points and a few sort of resources at the end, and definitely going to be watching back videos at 1.5 and see how that goes for me. I think that's a genius idea that I've thought about before, but I think I've gone too far and sort of gone to 2, and I've just thought, no, I can't do it at that volume or that speed. And so thank you very much for joining us and sharing this. I think it will be really, really useful for our teachers.
Thank you. And like I said, if anyone does want to check out some of the content, feel free to do so on the GP Learning YouTube channel. I prefer teaching through a visual method, so most of our stuff is on there in terms of the content that we create, and whether that's guides for general practice, but particularly in terms of teaching. One I would definitely recommend that people have a look at if they want interested. So I've done some videos on Zoom shortcuts in terms of keyboard shortcuts and things. Absolutely learn those. It will make your life so much easier because then you spend less time trying to find things on your screen and stuff. So particularly the inevitable microphone being off at the start of the meeting and that kind of stuff, that those hacks will make your life so much easier, both either as an attendee and definitely as somebody that's chairing the meeting as well. So the all-powerful Control and M on Zoom is one of the best keyboard shortcuts. If you don't know what that is, that's switching off everybody in the meeting so you can take complete control of their microphones and stuff. It's so good. Powers in the finger. So yeah.
Brilliant. We'll share those resources with our teachers. Thank you again for today. I think this will be really helpful for our teachers.
Thank you.
Brilliant.